I'll go ahead and get started. The first thing I will touch on is the election results in early November. Some of this, I know you guys have probably seen some of the emails we've sent out on this, so I'll just touch on this quickly. But the main headline from the November 2nd elections was that for the first time in recent history, voters did not approve a majority of the bond propositions on the ballot. And because of Senate Bill 30 that was passed in the 86th session, as you all know, districts have to now break up those propositions in according to various facility types. So there's more propositions on the ballot, and also voters can kind of pick and choose which projects they want to support. And so, as I mentioned, they voted down 55%, a majority of the propositions on the ballot. They did approve a majority of the dollars on the ballot. So the ones essentially that they voted down were among the smaller propositions. So we did see about 60% of the dollars on the ballot approved. We did some analysis of what kind of projects did voters tend to support, and what kinds of projects were voters more skeptical of. We saw those athletic facilities, stadiums, and auditoriums, those saw low levels of support. As I note there, less than 30% passage rate. Technology propositions, somewhat surprisingly, saw pretty high passage rates, almost 90% across the state. And this is just a guess, but one possible reason for that could be that communities see the need for schools to have robust connectivity and be able to offer connected devices and all that kind of stuff coming out of the pandemic, and so that possibly could have contributed to some of those high levels of support we saw across the state for those propositions. So that was a little bit of a silver lining. The other silver lining is that we saw high levels of support for the voter approval tax rate elections. Of those, I think it was almost 20 elections that were sort of on our radar during this last cycle, and about 85% of those passed across the state. So again, it was not the best day. Schools didn't get the results that they were across the board, but there were some silver linings that I think school districts can take away from that election. This just kind of puts those results in more historical perspective. You can see, I just go back to 2016 here, but schools generally saw high 60 to 70% approval rates of the bond propositions on the ballot. Then we can see Senate Bill 30 becoming effective there. Of course, many of those bond elections for the May 2020 election were canceled due to the pandemic, so that's why there's that low number there. So we begin to really see the impact of Senate Bill 30 here with that November 2020 election. Again, that was down to 60% approval, and then here in November, with this most recent cycle, only 45% approval. All right, I'm going to switch gears here to the news that was recently announced from TEA on the commissioner call last week. And then we got a TAA letter last night that sort of fills in some of the gaps on this as well. And so I'll go over all that here. So the first thing I want to point out, and I think I've mentioned this on previous FAC calls, but there's a provision in House Bill 1525 that was the main school finance bill that came out of the 87th regular session. There's a provision in that bill that prevents TEA from offering the hold harmless in the same way they had done it last school year and the year before that. And so again, that's just where TEA calculates the ADA hold harmless number for districts across the state, and then sort of no matter what happens, if your enrollment drops off or your attendance rate is bad, that ADA number that TA calculates for y'all is essentially rolled into the school finance system. House Bill 1525 prevents that kind of thing from occurring this school year. So what TEA has announced, so I just want to drive home the point that it's not a hold harmless in the same way that they have implemented in the past. So I'm going to call this an ADA adjustment. You may see it from other sources referred to as a hold harmless, but I think that will just confuse folks. So I just want to hopefully provide some clarity there. But there's really two adjustments that districts can be eligible for during this school year. And neither of them will help you with low enrollment. These adjustments are just going to help districts if they have really low attendance rates. And so I'll dive into sort of how those two adjustments can operate and sort of what impact they can have on your ADA that's used for funding purposes. The first one was announced through the proposed student attendance accounting handbook, and that is the tweak to the low attendance day waiver. We've sent out a number of emails and alerts and those kinds of communications on this waiver. For those of you that aren't familiar with this, the low attendance day waiver has been sort of on the books for years. Generally, the way it works is if you have a particular day in your school year that has an attendance rate that is lower than your average attendance rate for the prior year, then you can apply for a waiver and essentially remove that bad attendance day from your ADA calculation, right? So let's say your average attendance rate, in a normal year is 95%. For whatever reason, you had a bad attendance day during your school year of 80%, right? So more than 10% below your prior year average. You can apply for a waiver for that day. And then that day with the 80% attendance rate, that won't count towards your ADA calculation when it comes to funding for the year. So that's historically how that low attendance day waiver worked. The tweak that they made with the student attendance accounting handbook is that they've added this first bullet point here. Now you can choose the higher of the first 4-6 weeks of 1920 or the average attendance rate from the prior year, which is again how it's always been in place. So the advantage of this is I would bet that nearly all Region 1 districts and most districts across the state had a higher average attendance rate in that pre-pandemic period during the first 4-6 weeks of 1920 than they did during 2021. And so if that's the case for your district, then this tweak that TEA announced could make it a little bit easier for certain bad attendance days that you have this school year to become eligible for a low attendance day waiver. And so again, they're allowing that sort of that threshold to be pegged to a higher number. Again, that average attendance rate for the first 4-6 weeks. That then makes it easier to bring in days that are 10% below that higher cut point. So I just wanted to sort of make sure everyone was aware of this and sort of how this is going to operate. The sort of two key takeaways from this are in the attendance accounting handbook, TEA did not change the cap on waiver minutes that districts are eligible for. It's still 4,200 minutes. And that cap, within that cap includes all of the various waiver types. So there's staff development days, this low attendance day waiver, the missed school day waiver. All three of those, you can only, between all three waivers, you can only use 4,200 minutes or 10 days. And so there's no increase again in those number of minutes. That 4,200 minutes has kind of been where it's always been. So this change just makes it a little bit easier for certain days this school year to become eligible for the low attendance day waiver. It doesn't give you more waiver days. And so I think this is going to be sort of limited benefit to school districts. The other thing to point out is that because of the other announcement TEA made that I'll touch on here in a second, these low attendance day waivers will not be granted during the first 6 weeks of this school year. This summer, when you're going through your attendance data and you're trying to pick which days might be best to apply for a low attendance day waiver, you will only be able to pick the 2nd through the 6 weeks, days within that period. And so I just wanted to make sure y'all were aware of that the first 6-week period is not eligible for the low attendance day waivers. And that's because TEA is making an automatic ADA adjustment for the first 6 weeks of the school year. And that was what was announced in that TAA last week and on the commissioner call. And I think we've sent out a number of emails on that as well. The way this is going to work, this automatic ADA adjustment for the first 6 weeks of this school year, it's only going to apply to districts who have a low attendance rate during that first 6 weeks. And that low attendance rate has to be less than the target percentage attendance rate that TEA will calculate for y'all. And that target that TEA is going to calculate the lesser of those 2 points that I have at the bottom of the slide, the average attendance rate for the first 6-week period of 1920, or the district's average attendance rate for the final 3 6-week periods of 21-22. So essentially that average attendance rate over the spring semester of this school year. So a couple things to note there. So if you have low attendance during this first 6 weeks and you don't get that remedied by the spring semester of this school year, then this adjustment is again going to have limited benefits for you. So if your low attendance rate just stays constant for this school year, then you're not going to see a whole lot of upward adjustment under this provision that TEA announced. So I'll kind of walk through an example of that here real quick. So, and I should point out that this link here, if I can find my mouse right here in the slides that Region 1 has posted on their site, this is clickable. And so if you haven't seen that TEA letter, you can go in and see that there. So here's an example of how this would work. So you can see this first row here. This would be the ADA that your district reports in PEMS. So in this scenario here, this district reported 1,505 ADA in the first 6 weeks of this school year. That calculates out to an actual percentage rate for this district of 86%. Okay. Then they keep on going through the rest of the school year. You can see that that attendance rate starts to pick up over the course of the school year for this district, right? 86 and 89, and it ticks up and up. And so they get to the spring semester, and the average of their attendance rate for the 6-week periods in the spring semester, that averages out to 92.5%. Okay, and remember that the target is the lesser of their average attendance rate in the spring or their attendance rate from the first 6 weeks of 1920. And so in this example, that attendance rate from 1920 is 97%. So the lesser between 97 and the average of this would be the spring semester average of 92.5. So that becomes their target attendance rate. And then what TA is going to do is replace this 1505 with whatever ADA they calculate as if your attendance rate was this target percentage attendance rate. So just to go through that again, their actual attendance rate is 86%. TA is going to recalculate their ADA as if their attendance rate was this target rate of 92.5. That comes out to 1,619 for this district. And you can see all the other ADA amounts for the second through the sixth 6 weeks. Those remain the same as reported through PEMS. There's no adjustment made for the second through the sixth 6 weeks, okay? And so only this first 6 weeks changes as a result of this ADA adjustment. And this number for the first 6 weeks gets folded into the average for the year. And so you can see for this district, that adjustment results in 19 additional ADA for funding purposes. So I'm going to pause there. That was a lot. I want to pause for a moment to let folks have a chance to type in some questions, or if it's okay with Ms. Ruiz, we can have y'all come off mute and just chime in, however y'all want to do this.
Most definitely. Anyone that wishes to have questions, please unmute yourself.
Got one question from Ms. Perez at Region 1. I'll read it. I think it was just sent directly to me. It says, even though in the TAA letter they mentioned the agency will adjust operational minutes. Actually, I'll bring it here so you guys can read along. They mentioned the agency will adjust operational minutes for the LEA as necessary to increase the percentage attendance rate to the target. It doesn't have anything to do with operational minutes. So it technically, it is an adjustment to the operational minutes. That's sort of when you're thinking about the levers that TEA staff is going to pull to make this calculation, it is an adjustment to the operational minutes. But sort of the real impact for y'all is that it's just going to be that change in the minutes is going to result in a change in your ADA calculation. And so that's, I didn't really focus much on that change in the minutes. But yes, technically, you are correct. It is a change in the operational minutes. And then that will then result in a upwards revision to your ADA that's used for the first 6 weeks. Okay, can you re-show the slide for the lesser of? So it's on here, but I can go back to where I specifically spelled it out. It's the lesser of the attendance rate for the first 6 week period of 1920. So sort of pre-pandemic, period there, the first 6 weeks of 1920, or your average attendance rate for the spring semester of the school year. And again, these slides are posted on the Region 1 site, and this link here will take you to the TAA where they spell that out as well, I believe. Yeah, right here. So the first 6 week attendance period for 1920 or the spring semester of 21-22.
Josh, I want to make a comment. Later in the agenda, we do have Diana Perez and Brian Walker, our PEMS folks in Region 1. And so they will be sharing some of this information that we've captured through some survey that went out and that was shared with the RAC, with the superintendents a few days ago. So they will be providing this information. Districts already have it, but they will be also sharing that information with the entire team. Okay.
Yeah, and so kind of to that point, I've been reviewing that data, and many districts in Region 1 are seeing enrollment declines. I think more than 30 have seen, if I recall, more than 30 districts have seen enrollment declines of more than 5%. So these two ADA adjustments, that low attendance day waiver, the tweak to that waiver, and this sort of automatic adjustment to the first 6 weeks of this school year, those don't help you if your problem is strictly an enrollment problem. Okay, so this is not a hold harmless in the same way that sort of we've learned about in the past 2 school years. This will not sort of remedy your funding problems that are tied to enrollment declines. The main usefulness of both of these adjustments are just if you have low attendance rates during this school year. So I just want to make that clear that, you know, if you are experiencing enrollment declines, TA has not announced any remedy for that problem yet. And they are sort of limited in their options. They can't, because of 1525, they can't roll out a hold harmless in the same way that they had in the past. So I just want to make sure everyone's clear on that. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I'm gonna move on. The other thing that the agency announced on the commissioner call, and they of course sent out the one time I get my slides to Romaldo and Christina more than 30 minutes before my presentation. I sent it over to them last night, and then of course right after I hit send, TEA sent out at PAA, and so I think Christina and Romaldo will be getting the updated slides posted to the Region 1 site soon. So if you're following along, this slide may look a little different, but I'll kind of walk through what TEA announced. So there's been an extension to the deadline to collect forms, those economic disadvantage status forms. There's been an extension just for this school year. And you'll have until the fall resubmission deadline on January 20th to collect those forms and update students' indicator on PEIMS. Then they released a TAA last night that provides some additional information. It's not really worth going into in detail, but you know, it just kind of walks you through the specifics on how this could impact some other programs and sort of other things to keep in mind as you're communicating to families, sort of the need to get these forms in. And this is kind of all, if y'all are sort of wondering why TA made this change, just with those changes with the school lunch program, that sort of has removed some of the incentive, I think, for families to turn those forms back in. And so, you know, many districts are seeing lower levels of those forms come back. And so because of that, TA has announced this extension to hopefully give y'all some more time to communicate to your families, to your communities, and help them understand, you know, we need these forms to come back so that way we can get the proper level of funding from the state, from the feds. It's not just, you know, to give your student free lunches. There's other dollars that are attached to those. And so you have, again, until January 20th to collect those forms. One little technical bit here, it's still tied to the snapshot date. So the student had to have been economically disadvantaged as of the snapshot date. So that's, and PA goes into that in a little bit more detail on that TAA letter, but you don't get an extension of the snapshot date. The snapshot date's still the same, and their economic disadvantage status has to have been in place on that date. You just get a little bit more time to collect the forms and update those indicators on PEIMS. And TA held a webinar last summer, as I note there, that includes some best practices if you guys are looking to improve your processes at your district on how you distribute those forms and collect them and communicate with your families. There's some districts sort of shared best practices on that webinar, so that may be useful for y'all to review. All right, and Christina is noting that the revised PowerPoint has been uploaded, so thank you for that. All right, we're also getting some questions now that some of the, so of course 1525 passed during the A7 regular session. That made some changes to the 21-22 funding system. And so we're starting to see TEA implement some of those changes onto the SOF reports. And so we're getting some questions on what does this mean for us? You know, where are all these new data points coming from? So we'll kind of walk through some of those changes now. The first one is with the gifted and talented allotment. You can see that they've reinstated the new allotment. It's not quite at the same level as the GT allotment was prior to House Bill 3. If you guys remember, that was 0.12. That was the weight for the GT allotment prior to House Bill 3. House Bill 3 sort of removed it, or if you listen to legislators explain it, they'll say we rolled it into the revised basic allotment, right? That went up to 6160. And so the legislators' argument is that they rolled it, they simplified the school finance system by putting that the old GT allotment into the basic allotment of 6160. But now the GT allotment is back. It's back at 0.07. And of course, the basic allotment remains at 6160. So this is new money for school districts. And you can see how they've calculated it here on the summary finance screenshot that I've provided here. So the weight here, 0.07, that's in statute. And the math on this first row is pretty simple. Just 0.07 times the number of GT students. That equals your allotment times 6160. And then there's an adjustment for the enrollment cap. And so the cap, just as was the case with the old version of the GT allotment, there was a cap of 5% of your ADA. That is also the case with this reinstated GT allotment. So they show you the adjustment. If that's the case, there could be a downward adjustment to your allotment due to that 5% cap. There's also proration on the this new GT allotment. So that's one item that's different than the old GT allotment. So the legislators appropriated for all districts in the state, they appropriated $100 million for the GT allotment. And so you can see that there's no change here. And what that means is all of the GT allotments across the state, if you add that up, that equals something less than $100 million. If it does hit that number, if it does hit $100 million or more, you'll start seeing proration of your district's GT allotment. And what that means is they're going to reduce everybody's GT allotment by whatever factor is needed so that the total statewide spending on GT equals $100 million or less. Okay, and so just know that that could be the case. It's probably not going to hit $100 million this school year, but like many provisions in the school finance system, once the legislature sets it, they kind of set it and forget it, and they don't update it over a number of years. So as ADA grows and as the GT participation grows, in future years, it could hit that $100 million, and then we'll start seeing some proration there. For this school year, I don't think that will be the case, but that's sort of what's going on here on this line as they're showing you any potential impact of that proration. Then you see some set asides. Those are going to be relatively minor for folks, and so at the end, you'll see your adjusted allotment. And so that'll just be this number minus those set asides. That's your sort of final adjusted allotment. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's been some confusion. I think Romualda mentioned, sort of touched on this in the chat just now. TEA and the GT office there is, they've gone through a calculation that is based on the old GT weight of 0.12, and they've done that for every district in the state and put that out. And that's kind of caused some confusion when it comes to the spending requirements. So the spending requirement of the new GT allotment is 100%. So districts are kind of scratching their heads saying, what do I need to spend 100% of? Is it 100% of this amount that's in TEA spreadsheet, or what I see in my summary finance, or what's going on? So in short, you have to spend 100% of what appears on your summary of finance row for GT. So it's just the GT allotment as calculated under the 0.07 weight, the new GT allotment. That's what you have to spend 100% of. TEA spreadsheet, again, they're trying to make this argument that some GT money is in the 6160, right? Because if we think back to prior to House Bill 3, that was their argument. They're simplifying the system. They're rolling the old GT allotment into the 6160 because they didn't want districts to just do away with their GT program once that allotment went away. And so this is really just semantics on TEA's part. They're trying to support the legislators' talking points. And I think that's really why that spreadsheet got put together. And it was calculated at the old weight because they want y'all to, not reduce your spending on your GT program. They don't want you to reduce it from what it was prior to House Bill 3. But the key takeaway for y'all here is that 100% requirement only applies to this number that you see on your summary of finance for the GT allotment. Okay, so what you see here for that adjusted allotment, that final number, that is what the spending requirement applies to. Okay. The other thing to note is that's a little bit different with this new GT allotment is that it kind of has a use it or lose it provision. There's a section of 1525 that says the GT allotment funds must be returned to the state if the district has failed to implement a program. And so we're not totally sure how the agency will interpret that or what counts as failure to implement a program. And so we're trying to get some clarity on that from the agency, and we can share that out once we have that. But I would imagine if you're still operating your GT program in the same way you did prior to House Bill 3, and there are certain performance standards or certain program standards that the agency has put out. If you're check with your program director, make sure you guys are adhering to those. But we're not exactly sure sort of what that compliance check will look like from the agency yet. Okay, the other bit of confusion we're seeing in terms of spending requirements has to do with the dyslexia allotment. There was an update to the FASRAG, specifically that description of PIC 37. They added that clause there that I have highlighted in yellow. It reads, and the services are not funded from the dyslexia state allotment. That seems like a strange thing to add to a description of PIC 37, which is called dyslexia. And so many districts were confused about that. And we reached out to David Marks and his team, and he confirmed that actually that was a typo. The update to the FASRAG for PIC 37 was a typo. Both PIC 37 and PIC 43 can be utilized for the dyslexia allotment that was created by House Bill 3. And so this bullet point here, I believe I've shared that email with Romalda, if you guys want, for your auditor or whoever else, if you want that in writing, I believe she can share that with y'all. But this bullet point here is taken straight from the email with David Marks. So just be aware that that update to PIC 37 was inaccurate, and I think there'll be a correction made soon. The main difference, so PIC 37 and PIC 43 both are related to the dyslexia allotment. The difference between the two is that one counts for the federal MOE calculation, PIC 43 counts for that MOE calculation, PIC 37 does not. Okay, so when you're planning for your MOE, when you're making those plans for MOE compliance, just know that PIC 43 is what's used for that calculation. And any of the expenditures on PIC 37, those will not be counted. See a question about GT. Is the GT allotment still based on the PEAMS fall submission of reporting? Well, so I believe GT is an ADA count because it's limited to 5% of your total ADA. And so I believe it's I believe it would have to come from the PEAM submission at the end of the school year. But that's a good question. Let me do a little bit more homework on that and figure out where exactly that data is coming from. But I do know it's capped at 5% of the ADA. And so I would think that that would make it an ADA count, but let me double check that. The other thing I wanted to note here is that, so we touched on the GT allotment and that there is proration there. That's not the only allotment that the legislature implemented proration on. This is sort of a new feature of the school finance system that they put in place across a number of allotments. And so the formula transition grant is another place where they implemented this. And for those that are unfamiliar with that term, this is the hold harmless that House Bill 3 created for districts that potentially lost money under House Bill 3. And so the legislature originally committed to holding districts harmless from House Bill 3 for 5 years. It took them one session to start backing away from that. And they're starting to back away from that commitment with this spending limit. They've put in place, they've appropriated $400 million for this school year for this grant. Based on the LPE numbers that we're seeing in the summary finance right now, that's already amounted to a reduction of 89%. So, districts were, the legislature promised that they would hold districts harmless from House Bill 3. Now they're only holding you 89% hold harmless. And that number can bounce around a little bit once we get new tax collection data and student count data for the school year. But if you guys are receiving that grant and you're wondering why it's lower than maybe you were originally expecting, that's very likely due to the proration that House Bill 1525 put in place. There's also proration on that fast growth grant, the fast growth allotment. And so just know that, and we are seeing some proration down. So your districts that are eligible for that new fast growth allotment, they are not getting 100% of what the formula would calculate for them. So we're already seeing, again, that proration have an impact on the funding that districts are receiving. I've touched on this before, and so I'll move through this pretty quickly, but I just want to make folks aware that PEA has identified some issues with those ESSER 3 plans. So go make sure that you've that you're compliant with those. I think Region 1 has some resources and some there that your district should take advantage of, and make sure that you have someone looking at your plan, make sure that it's compliant with all the federal requirements. I think so far the agency has reviewed around 100, maybe more by now, but only I think less than 10 of them were found to be fully compliant. If you haven't heard anything from the agency on that, I think they have randomly selected 300 districts to review, and they're going to kind of move through districts in cohorts of 300. And so that just means you haven't been selected yet. But I do believe the agency's plan is to review all of the district's plans. And ultimately, the feds will review the plans as well. So this is going to be important to stay on top of. The other thing to note is the remaining ESSER 3 allocation. ESSER 3 allocation should be available for you to go and apply for in late November or early December. You'll recall that when you submitted your application for ESSER 3, you only applied for the first 2/3 of it. The remaining 1/3 was supposed to be contingent on the state getting its ESSER 3 plan approved. Well, it did that. It did that back in July, but due to sort of technical issues at the agency, they were not able to open up that application for y'all to go in and access that remaining 1/3. There were some delays there, and so it does seem like the plan now is to reopen that again here in the coming weeks. So just know that that is coming. You'll need to go in and do another amendment to your application. And we've touched on this before, but just in case you guys weren't aware, there's a tweak to the sort of accounting rules around when you can recognize ESSER revenues. For ESSER 2, you can recognize the portion of ESSER 2 that you used to supplant state funds for the hold harmless. You can recognize that portion regardless of when you got the NOGA for ESSER 2. So if you got your NOGA during the 21-22 school year or fiscal year, and but you want to recognize that portion in 2021, you can do that. It doesn't matter. It's not dependent on when you got your NOGA. The recognition of that portion of ESSER 2 that was used to supplant state aid. If you received ESSER 2, any portion of ESSER 2 above that amount you used to supplant state aid for the hold harmless, recognizing that amount is going to be contingent on when you got your NOGA. Okay, so if you got your NOGA in the 21-22 school year, you can only recognize the revenue for that sort of extra portion of ESSER 2 in that school year. So just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of that guidance that was coming out of TEA. And so that same kind of logic applies to ESSER 3. Since there's no portion that's used to supplant state aid, recognizing that revenue is going to be tied to when you got your NOGA. So if you really hustled and got your application in early and got your NOGA back during the 2021 school year, you can begin recognizing that revenue in 2021. But if you got it in 21-22, then you would have to wait to recognize it in that school year. Okay, so got a couple more slides here. There has been some calls for a special session. The governor has not indicated he's very receptive to those calls. They've mostly been centered around voting issues and revisiting some of the voting bills that were debated during the 87th session and the subsequent special sessions. And so that's really been where most of the focus has been on with these requests for a special session. But, as y'all are aware, there has been a lot of interest amongst legislators and folks running for other statewide positions in library materials. And so there haven't been any calls yet for a special session related to, library materials or instructional materials. But that could be something that's on the horizon. TEA has been asked to essentially pass along for criminal investigation if they do find any problematic materials that have been provided to students. And so the governor is definitely sort of turning on the heat a little bit on this issue. And it's likely that we could see an interim charge on this topic come out here in the next, sort of in the near future. So I don't think that this issue is going away, but it could be something that the governor potentially, if there is to be a special session, I could see that as something that it definitely has the governor's attention. And so that could be something that's added later on. But just for clarity, there has not been any official call for a fourth special session yet. The last thing I want to touch on is the infrastructure bills. We saw earlier this week, President Biden sign the hard infrastructure bill. The bulk of that goes to roads, bridges, ports, buses, trains, that kind of thing. There are some K-12 items and sort of K-12 adjacent items. The biggest one is that $65 billion for broadband expansion. I know, districts experience a lot of connectivity issues, while y'all were trying to roll out the virtual learning programs. And so to the extent that you guys are still offering that, there could be some resources in this bill to help get families connected and, with the high quality connection. And so, a big investment there. And then the remaining items in that bill are sort of K-12 specific. There's $5 billion for clean energy school buses, $500 million for energy efficiency projects at schools, and $200 million to remove lead from school drinking water. And so, of course, there's gonna need to be a lot of implementation work that's done before schools will be applying for any of this money, or sort of how it's distributed to states. And so there's more details to come, but there are some dollars for those initiatives that has been signed into law. So we'll be sharing some more information on that once those details are available. The other bill, the Build Back Better bill, I believe the last figure I saw was actually $1.85 trillion. I think it's gone up. The price tag on that's gone up a little bit during the negotiations in Congress. And I believe that has passed the House as of this morning. And so that's kind of where it got really bogged down. And so there's a lot of back and forth in the House on the sort of the size and scope of this bill. I think at one point it was the spending, and it was north of $3 trillion. It's since been scaled back to 1.8 now, and it includes a number of provisions. Sort of the big ticket item for K-12 is the money for preschool. It includes, as I note there, about $400 billion for universal preschool. And the way this will work is it'll be distributed to states. So TEA will kind of facilitate that. And it's for the first 3 years, essentially the federal government covers 100% of the cost to provide these programs. And then it starts sort of scaling back over, I think, a period of 5 or 6 years after that. So this is not a permanent entitlement in this bill. This is sort of covering startup costs for universal preschool. essentially, and then states will be on the hook for it after that. So, and this, the preschool provision has been in, it's survived sort of multiple rounds of negotiation. And so it obviously is included in the version that came out of the House this morning. And so now it's on to the Senate. And so we'll see, you know, if that provision stays, but it does seem to be pretty popular. And like I said, it survived multiple rounds of negotiation so far. And so I would imagine if this bill does make it over the finish line, that it would include some money for universal preschool.